It is now my privilege to bring to you Miss Shyla Bradley and her paper, The Christian Democracy.
Hegel's idea of the absolute notion is the progression of Western civilization. It is history that builds upon past events, not merely in physical buildings, but in thought, reason, and logic. Western civilization is the progression of individuals' freedom over collectivism, and its relation to government and religion, the only true history. What are the primary elements of Western civilization that led to American democracy? And what did Christianity contribute to this progress? The Greeks referred to the universe as the cosmos, meaning beautiful order, for they had a deep appreciation of natural perfection. Their passionate pursuit of beauty and order drove them to unexplored territories of liberty and unrestrained beliefs of a religious system speckled with a multiplicity of gods that were head of their own sphere of beauty. These gods, each caring for a different part of society and nature, was order to them. If they lacked wisdom for a particular action, they would pray and sacrifice to the goddess Athena in hopes of gaining wisdom or the approval desired. The many different gods all were given this kind of attention for everyday occurrences. Tell us why Apollo rages so, whether he blames us for a vow we failed or sacrifice, says Achilles. This polytheistic religion highly influenced the Greeks' daily lives and spilled into how they viewed their political system. Their belief in many gods, one for nearly every aspect of their lives, and each with their corresponding jobs and powers, led the Greek people to form a government in a similar manner. A broad governmental state with its powers being separate and spread over the entire country. In not having a single all-powerful god, their government also lacked an all-powerful leader and political force. The Greeks had a system of law and order, with a court system of different levels corresponding to the ownership of property and livestock. This type of legal organization gave even poor people a part of enforcing the laws. Nemo est supra legem. The result more equalized the people and limited the excessive power of the rich. Solon was an influential Athenian government leader who helped increase the liberties of Greece with his fair, just, and equal application of the law to both the rich and poor alike. Solon's careful attention to justice created a society in where every man's estate is truly his own, and therefore planting the seeds of personal property rights. This drive for excellence in philosophy and law helped them develop a more democratic and powerful culture. In Herodotus' book, Demaratos, a Greek who joined the forces with the Persians, said, "Excellence is something acquired through intelligence and the force of strict law. It is through the exercise of this excellence that Hellas wards off both poverty and despotism." The Greek Empire, with its pursuit of excellence and its form of government, is what contributed to forming the foundational ideas of the American founding fathers. The Greeks further differentiated themselves from the rest of the world with their love of philosophy, the pursuit of logic and wisdom. Some of the founding authors of this philosophy are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Their pursuits in philosophy and logic were revolutionary and helped the Greek culture thrive. Though being raised in this polytheistic culture, Plato, through his philosophy, began to question the belief in many gods. His pursuit of logic and reason led him to reason out the characteristics of God, that a true God must be singular and all-powerful. He may not have completely abandoned his Greek polytheistic heritage, but he understood his culture's belief in many gods did not match up to the new logic being discovered. Plato's student Aristotle pursued that logic and reason even further, and came to believe that there is only one God, and that he is supreme, powerful, good, perfect, and unchangeable. This single God is what he calls the prime mover, the first motion that moves everything else, and this first mover must be in itself unmovable. He knew a multiplicity of gods is against the nature of a God, which is a supreme and all-powerful being. Logic shows there cannot be two, for then one is not supreme. Aristotle states, therefore, that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration continuous and eternal belong to God, for this is God. Plato and Aristotle started an explosion of philosophical thinking in reason and logic. The Greek people knew their culture and freedom was unique in comparison to the rest of the world. They did not want to give it up. During the Persian Wars, they would rather die fighting for their freedom than to trade it for safety and money. They chose that Hellas should survive in freedom. Even their enemies noted their patriotism to liberty and honor. What kind of men did you lead us here to fight, who compete not for money, but for excellence alone? Many of the Greek ideas are commonplace today, but they were quite striking in comparison to the governments of the rest of the world. The Greeks distinguished themselves as a different kind of civilization. They were the founders of Western civilization. The many different gods of Greece led to choice, and thus a kind of freedom. But trying to appease the many different gods made morality chaotic and left it drifting at sea. The fall of Athens came from the people succumbing to their passions, and their pursuit of excellence diminished after war and plague. Thucydides agrees, stating, perseverance in what men called honor was popular with none. It was so uncertain whether they would be spared to attain the object, but it was settled that present enjoyment and all that contributed to it was both honorable and useful. Fear of gods or law of man there was none to restrain them. A democracy is reflective of its people's character, and when the people are free and virtuous, then its society and country will flourish. But the Grecian polytheistic religious system and the free government gave way to wandering morals and a lack of direction, which led to their rapid and disastrous end. As Benjamin F. Morris states, it gave to the Greek religion and government the same ideal features, making the first a realm peopled with gods, and the second a system of but little political force or permanency. The Greek democracies were subject to sudden changes, and were wrecked amid the wild and tumultuous waves of liberty. Even Nietzsche cannot deny this truth, that the Greeks' immorality led to the early destruction of their culture. Among the conservatives of ancient Athens, who let themselves go, toward happiness, as they said, toward pleasure, as they acted, and who all the while still mouthed the ancient pompous words, to which their lives no longer gave them any right. The people of Athens had no cohesive morality to keep their unique democratic system stable, and people's moral character does not last long when it is untethered to religion with its anchored virtues. Nietzsche's failure to recognize the rest of this truth shows how easy it is to lose sight of the foundational pillars of democracy. The rise of the mighty Roman Empire owes much of its success to the Greek culture, for they borrowed heavily from them. The Romans also adopted the Greek polytheism, but a very watered-down version of it. Eventually, the Roman cultural mindset wandered and drifted away from polytheism and expanded more into governmental affairs and the enjoyment of their rights and modern achievements. A Roman citizen can no more be disloyal to his country than to the gods. This conviction gave to the government a religious character and made it invincible in war and strong in governmental authority and influence. The American founding fathers gained the idea of freedom from the Western civilization of the Greeks and Romans. The two empires were prosperous because of the freedom that they gave their people. They also learned that a strong, commonly shared morality is necessary for the survival of so great a freedom, and that religion must play a primary role for success, adding their orderly monotheism in place of the chaotic Greek gods. Christianity came at the perfect time for a people tired of the disorganized and meaningless religion of the Greek and Roman world. The beginnings of a natural monotheism can be seen in the Western civilization of Greece and Rome, and its worldwide acceptance can almost be seen at Christianity's birth. Many people were ready to come to the belief in a single, all-powerful God through logic and reason. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse. The philosophers knew God through his creation, and discerned his attributes through reason. Christianity's monotheism knew God by way of the Old Testament and the miracles and teaching of Christ. Together they set fire to the world in leading people to the Christian belief in God, which then led to furthering Western civilization and its drive for freedom. Romans 13 is the prominent biblical chapter referred to concerning a Christian's view of government. Part of it establishes absolute truths in human and divine relationships, but other parts are open for differing interpretations, such as whether governments exist by divine predestination or by human choice. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. The Bible is clear that authority comes from God, and the authority being spoken of is a righteous and godly authority. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. This passage is primarily taken in two ways. One, that governments are servants and ministers of God, and that these servants are there to punish evil. The Calvinist view gives all respect to the leaders, and that these leaders should hardly be challenged or questioned, for they are doing the will of God. The other view, the view of the Founding Fathers, is that all respect is due only to good governments and good authorities. They believed and respected that the position of government is an important and God-ordained position to hold. They held the position in more esteem than the actual leader, because the leader is not always good or godly. It never occurred to the people to attack the principle of social authority or to contrast its rights. They simply divided the exercise of power in order that the office should be strong and the officer weak, and that society should be free and well governed. This biblical passage clearly is referring to good governments and ministers of God doing his will. The passage does not say that God is the author of evil governments. Even Calvin cannot allow government's total control over his life, as he concedes, we must always make the exception. No, must be particularly careful that it's not incompatible with the obedience to him, whose will the wishes of all kings should be subject. Since good government comes from God, then it should be following God's principles, laws, and will. The rulers of good government are also subject to God, just as the people are, and have to obey and serve him first before anything else, since they are ministers of God. When a government is evil and does not obey God, then they are no longer ministers of his will. A government pressing a people and not allowing them to live the life God gave them and forcing them to disobey God is a government that has given up its right to rule over people. It is up to the people to free themselves from the oppressive or bad government and make a new one that matches God's will and plans. In the Declaration of Independence, it states that when government evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. A person must obey God first before he takes into account anyone else, even the government. Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men. One must obey and fear the one who can kill both the soul and the body over the one who can kill only the body." Jesus did not place himself under the final authority of the Roman Empire, and neither did he with his relationship to the church. When the Roman leader Pontius Pilate told Jesus that he has the power to kill him, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above." The Jewish religious leaders also knew Jesus acted outside of their authority. While Jesus was performing miracles and forgiving sins, they told him to stop teaching, and they questioned him by saying, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" For they knew he was not acting on their authority. Jesus continued to do the will of God over and above every authority on earth. Christianity brought many ideas to American democracy, and a Christian doing God's will is doing more than just adopting a Western civilization idea. It is a statement of faith, a lifestyle, a belief system. It is the premise on which the American founding fathers based their governing beliefs. The American founding fathers projected this Christian belief in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One can see the seeds of liberty that Christ planted and his followers watered are in full bloom in this statement. The right to life began when man was first created and brought into being. God made man and gave him life for a reason. Having the liberty to find this reason is every man's inherent right granted by God. Liberty or freedom does not mean that a person can do anything he wants. He is not at liberty to take another man's life or to restrict another man's freedom to find the reason he has been created. Inherent freedom has an inherent set of rules to live by. Liberty looks upon religion as its companion in its struggles and triumphs, as the cradle of its young life, as the divine source of its claims. It considers religion as the guardian of morality, morality as the guarantee of law, and security that freedom will last. Freedom is the ability to exercise one's God-given rights and to do what is right. It is not anarchy. Equality is another idea that Christianity brought to Western civilization and the American democracy. Absolute equality means two or more objects or persons are the same with no difference, which is impossible, for no two things can be exactly the same. The fact that men created by God are different mentally and physically, as well as their thoughts, morals, beliefs, and pursuits, illustrates that the American founders' idea of equality was not based on this absolute characteristic. Equality was based on man's creation and his standing under God as a result of being created. He, a created being, is not God, but does have a reason for existing. This simple belief means that every human is on equal standing with one another, and that the rights granted to them, while under God, the Creator. This is the basis of equality and the Christian belief. Being on equal standing with each other, no man can rule another man without his consent. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Founding Fathers established a democracy that operated on the same principles as the Christian belief system. This type of government does not allow for one person to rule men. It separates the power of authority, and leaders are selected by the people to oversee that these rights are not infringed. He obeys not because he holds an inferior position to those who run the administration, or is less capable than his neighbor of self-government, but because he recognizes the usefulness of his association with his fellow men, and because he knows that this association cannot exist without a regulating power. American democratic government is not men ruling other men. It is men overseeing the administration of the democratic system so that it sustains the protection of man's inherent God-given liberties. The Christian concept of freedom is shown in the Bible by man striving against God without immediate judgment. God allows man to choose his own path and disregard finding the reason he was given life in the first place, at least for a while before final judgment. My spirit shall not strive with man forever. Man's inherent freedom is shown through this grace. Grace is the allowance of free will, the ability to pursue happiness, rightly or wrongly, for an allotted amount of time, before the payment comes due. What did one do with the life and freedom one was given? Did one find the reason for one's life? Did one use his freedom to prevent others from finding theirs? The purely Christian idea of grace highly influenced American democracy. In America, one is presumed innocent until proven guilty. The only reason for grace is because a just God ultimately desires mercy. Grace allows for a fallen creation to return to him, if so desired. This combination of both justice and mercy are opposites, and for them to come together, there needs to be grace, a time for man to be made right. Man's pursuit of happiness, along with life and liberty, is in relation to man's creation. God called his creation good, and he was happy with what he had made. And man's happiness is directly related to God's happiness and the freedoms he gave to man. God alone is man's true good. To make man happy, it must show him that a God exists when we are bound to love, that our true bliss is to be in him, and our soul ill to be cut off from him. The Declaration of Independence does not give man any rights. It merely states people's inherent rights, and that they originate from God. American democracy was established to preserve this special created relationship between God and man. The Christians who came over to the New World came with the attitude of willingly submitting to God's rule over their life. Many were escaping religious oppression or persecution, and they wanted to follow God as he has called them. Their morals came from God, his word, and the Holy Spirit, who dwells in them and can discern and judge of their thoughts. I will put my laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This Holy Spirit is a guide and helper for those who have come to God through Christ. The Christians who came to America to start a new country came with this belief that they were already being voluntarily self-governed by God. Now the Lord is a spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. If one is being governed by God, then who can step in between them? Christians accepting an old, written, and detailed morality, like the biblical commandments, gained in a significant source of stability. Because these laws are based on an unchangeable God and are accepted as truth, and being sacred, they are not open to the changing whims of people. Christians live with a strong sense of law and order, with or without the aid of government. They are often criticized for this hard belief. The Old Testament commandments, the idea of future judgment and forgiveness, justice and mercy, is always present in the Christian mind. Christians have taken the sense of law and order and applied it to government. Blasphemy, witchcraft, adultery, rape were punished by death. Never was the death penalty more frequently prescribed, and never more rarely enforced. The laws of God were naturally applied to the government because Christians already lived in this way, with respect for themselves and each other. The American system of government was not put together entirely from scratch. No, much of it came in larger packages of collectively held ideas and beliefs. A belief in a singular, supreme creator God is one of these packages. A morality package of ideas that were already assumed to be right and true and taken from Judaism and Christianity is another one. These packages are the premise that the American system was built with. John Adams, one of the founding fathers, says, "We have no government armed with the power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and true religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Government was never looked at to be the authority of their morality or laws. That already came from God. But the government was seen as necessary for the order of a Western civilization culture, and to ensure that their God-given rights were known and secure. Western civilization is progression, as it grows and builds on its past, not merely in physical buildings, but in thought, reason, and logic. It is true history. The ancient Greek culture, of a belief in a fantastic assortment of gods, offering a variety of ideas and virtues to follow, left them with a chaotic and directionless morality. But in this culture, the Greeks set themselves apart from the rest of the world in their pursuit of reason and logic, forming the basis of a lawful democratic government. Their further development of philosophy would eventually lead to the idea of a singular God. Christianity, which builds upon Judaism in the Old Testament, also builds upon Western civilization's development of logic and sciences of the natural world. It is the final step in the progression of Western civilization's reason and fulfills the original ideas of the ancient philosophers in its belief in one God and mankind's duty to him above all others. Christianity also brought with it a strong law and ordered morality, which gave its people a secure handle to hold on to for liberty's intense passions and growths. Without Christianity, Western civilization would have reached its peak with the Roman Empire. But the fervency of the Christian faith that no man can stand between the Christian and his God, and staking his life upon this belief, suffering centuries of persecutions and death, led Western civilization to a height the Greeks and Romans would never have dreamed of, the American democracy. With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Western civilization is inseparable from Christianity, and Christianity may even turn out to be the fulfillment of Western civilization, the progress of history, science, philosophy, and religion, the absolute notion, as Hegel so eloquently speaks of.
Thank you very much, Miss Bradley. I just quite honestly, my head's a little bit spinning. The position that you take in this paper is one I have never heard before in a GPT-5 paper. You are looking, you, it appears that you are what would be called a Christian Hegelian, which is kind of interesting. The Hegelians, there was the Marxist Hegelians and there were the Christian Hegelians, and there was actually a Hinrichs who was the leader of the Christian Hegelians. So I've kind of been interested in that track and have never really followed that path down. But in this paper, you really have kind of laid hold of that basic premise that there is a flow to history and that Western civilization, with Christianity as its sort of dynamo, is the center of that flow of civilization. And to see that culminating in the American democracy is at once a very exciting idea and almost a little worrying because it seems hubristic and a little prideful. But I want to look at what you're laying out here. And I guess maybe it would be good to begin with this quote that you gave here. This, I think, is a John Adams quote. Yeah, he said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And you know, a lot of times when people look at the question, is America a Christian government, they look at, you know, what laws are on the books. Do we have Christian laws on the books? And that oftentimes doesn't seem a real fruitful approach. But you seem to be taking a much a more philosophic approach rather than just looking at laws and saying that Christianity is what allows American and the tradition of Western democracies to both pursue the freedom of the individual and an adherence to lawfulness. And that those seem to be combined under the Christian concept of freedom and yet law before God. And so I guess I just kind of want to understand if I've gotten the correct, if I've understood that position clearly. And so yeah, maybe if you could just explain and I guess let me read the quote again, and I would like you to explain in what sense you see that quote being particularly true of American democracy. It says, "We have no government armed with the power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and true religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." In what sense are you arguing here that American democracy can only be a Christian democracy?
Well, for the sense that, like, in the democracies of the past, like the Greek democracy, they didn't have Christianity, but they did have multiple gods. But they didn't have really a really stable morality that people can base their lives off of. They had, so it was, with their democracy, it just ran wild and ended up, they rose really fast to great heights and then fell very quickly. And it was because of their, it just, as you can tell in the, like, you got Alcibiades, who was just a crazy passion guy. They just ran wild with their passions because they didn't have a strict morality to base it off of. And so if you're going to have a democracy, you need a very strict morality to live your life off of, because liberty can be chaotic sometimes. And Christianity brings the strict morality to people's lives.
Would you see then, if Christianity is so interested in the imposition of morality through government, does Christianity then make the imposition of that law, particularly through law enforcement, a crucial issue for Christians?
Law enforcement, I wasn't necessarily talking about law enforcement, but just the idea, because there's laws of gods that aren't physical that we can necessarily do law enforcement through. Like in Matthew, it says that let me think of what I was trying to say. Oh, that even if you're angry with your brother, you're still deserving of murder. So those leaving detailed specifics of you don't even have to kill someone to be indicted for murder by God. You can just be angry and you can still be threatened with, I mean, you basically are like you murdered him in your heart. So we don't have laws like that that can be enforced on people to prevent that, because that's actually for God's position, not government.
Well, let's come back to kind of the big scandalous idea that you brought forward, and that is, do you believe that seeing American democracy as a unique fulfillment of the direction of Western history, and particularly Christian Western history, would you hold that that is something you can really see by looking at history, like Hegel believes, that you can really see that that history does lead to this as the climax of history? Or is that simply egotistical American patriotism? And I'll just give you one more comment. I was talking about this when Ben and I went back to St. John's. I was brought this idea that we've been looking at from Hegel to him, and I said, isn't that just kind of, Eurocentrism? And he just nodded. And I said, well, what about the East? What about China? It has a huge history over there. What about their history? And he said, the distinction he said is that they have change but no history. And that because Christianity has been at the center of the West, we have a history in the sense of a story. In the East, you have change. Things happen, but you don't have history. So, is saying that American democracy as a culmination of European culture is, you might say, the highest expression of that. Can you really define that as anything but just kind of Amerocentrism?
Well, it's a good question, but not sure quite how to answer, but I'll do my best. You can kind of see how, like, take example for China, they not necessarily, they have change, but not necessarily history, and that's what he said. You can kind of see how what it's like is because they never really progress from one thing to another. They have leaders, they have changing leaders, but it's always in a form of like an oppression that one leader rules everyone, and they don't got no choice in it. They just go on with their lives and nothing really grows or happens. In Western civilization, you can see the change from the oppressiveness of leaders to democracy, where you don't have the oppressiveness of the government and people are allowed to live their lives how God wants them to. And that's why I think also Christianity is a big importance for Americans, because that would limit a lot of the egotistical view of American, is if you have God, because we are not necessarily freeing ourselves of all authority. We are just limiting ourselves to under God's authority, not man's authority.
Would you say being able to maintain the distinction between human freedom and human responsibility under law is a balance that can only properly be lived out by a heavily Christian culture?
Yeah, I would think so, because liberty is one of the things it's very hard to define, and sometimes you get confused with doing whatever you want. In the Bible, it talks about doing whatever you would like but with a right attitude and towards what is good and what is right. Because it says that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So if there's freedom wherever the Spirit of the Lord is. So with God, He is always right. So with right, you got liberty. So if you just do what is right, then you got liberty.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Robert.
Oh yeah, so I just want to go back. First of all, that was an amazing paper. I loved how you combined history, politics, and theology all into one paper. I thought that was great. Anyway, going back to what you were saying in one of your earlier paragraphs, let me see if I can find what you wrote. Which we were talking about how when a government loses its sight on Christianity, they cannot be ministers of His will. What do you mean by that?
So basically, that government is put and the authorities are put into place by God, but they're only governing authorities if they are doing His will, because it says that government, that the rulers are there to be ministers of God, and that they're servants to Him, so that they can basically rule the people in a way that is rightly towards God. So, let me.
Okay, and
What was
then
it?
the follow-up to that is, so was the fact that Nazi Germany came to power, which led to the oppression of the Jewish people and the mass murder of them, but because Nazism ultimately was defeated and the Jewish people were given their own country, was Nazi Germany still being used as part of God's overall plan and will to give the Jewish people their own country, or was that just sort of... Anyway, my question is, was Nazi Germany still in God's will for that to happen, for the Jewish people to have their own state, or because they weren't Christian, that wasn't part of God's will?
Okay, I see what you're meaning. God can use anything for His will, but so like to make the Jews have their own state, that might have needed to happen, or it just happened because it just, I mean, this world is full of corrupt human beings that like to destroy what is God's, and that also happens. But God likes to make things good out of evil, even through that.
Okay, so you're saying that even though Nazi Germany was not executing God's will, but they were used in the overall plan of God's will. Is that what you're saying? Because that was
Yeah.
kind of confusing
Yeah.
to me when you wrote that. But okay,
Yeah.
thank you, that was my question.
And Molly.
Wonderful paper. It was really, kind of like what Robert was saying. I loved how you mixed so many different things together and made it flow so beautifully. I guess my question is, I'm going to try and phrase it as least confused as I can, is, you have the John Adams quote saying how the Constitution is for religious people, but in the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution, it explicitly says that the government cannot establish religion. And the reason for that was, I guess, because, James Madison kind of said it best. I'm going to kind of paraphrase it, but he was saying how the, intertwinement of church and state, or, the religion and government, can devalue religion and also corrupt government, which I'm sure Veronica would help me on the history of that with the Catholic Church and different things. So I guess I want to know your opinion on that, and if you truly think that it's the government's job, or if they should have the authority to enforce religion, even if it is our religion.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me think a little bit more. So even though John Adams said that it's made for moral and religious people, it doesn't mean necessarily that government has to establish a certain particular religion to government for the whole of the country. It just means that that religion is just the best to work out the actual governing principles of and laws of the country.
But
So-
would using a specific religion's morals kind of, in a sense, be establishing that religion in a sense? Because other religions might, differ in some ways. Or if they're non-religious, their beliefs and their view on different issues would differ.
Yeah, they would, but I mean, our founding fathers set up our country with Christianity in mind. So I guess all I can say is that whatever they whatever morality they used is what should be continued to be used. Because yeah, Heather.
Okay, I liked your paper. I have a few questions. But I first want to ask you, do you think that democracy is the best example of a Christian family?
It doesn't even. I just think my view is that Christianity best suits democracy better than any other type of religion because of its strict morality compared to others. Yeah.
Okay, and then I had another question. In one of your paragraphs, sort of towards the end, you said that the Christian concept of freedom is shown in the Bible by man striving against God without immediate judgment. And God allows man to choose his own path and disregard for any reason that he's given life in the first place, at least for a while before final judgment. So, I just thought that was interesting because a lot of the time when they're talking about salvation in the New Testament, they talk about us being saved from slavery of the law, and then Christ is the one that brings us into freedom. So, I think it's Galatians 5, it says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. And I was just wondering if you meant that we just had, it was just like the right to live, or you were talking about, we had freedom, but then we have salvation. And how does that contrast? Is the salvation just like more freedom and true freedom compared to what we had before?
I would say that salvation does bring more freedom, but you don't necessarily need salvation to have freedom, I guess, in a way. As long as you're doing what is right and what God likes, you can have freedom. I guess that's still, in a way, towards Christianity. So, I think we still had freedom even in the very beginning without salvation, because he put us down here and we can he didn't, what am I trying to say? When man sinned in the beginning, God did not put him to death right away. So in a way, we still can choose to do wrong and still live right now so it's just our choice, freedom choice. Yeah.
But we would still be in slavery to our sin.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Hans.
Thank you. I enjoyed your paper. You took one of the hardest writers in GBT and one of the most controversial topics in GBT being government and put it together. So that's impressive. I wanted to ask about a section of your 5th paragraph. You stated that the Grecian polytheistic religious system and the free government gave way to wandering morals and a lack of direction, which led to their rapid and disastrous end. Do you think that the polytheism caused the deterioration of Greek culture, or do you think it was in other words, is any form of religion a basis for the government and culture, or was it the deterioration of that religion which led to the fall of culture?
Yes, I do think that the religion was somewhat contributed to the fall of Athens, because the gods, they were kind of very inconsistent in their laws that they would give to man. and they wouldn't even give hardly laws. They just had certain things that they had in mind that kind of contradicted each other. And if one people would follow one god, the other people would follow another, and then those gods would clash, and so the people would clash, and it's just kind of crazy. So I do think that religion plays a big part in the governing system of the country, because whatever you have your beliefs on, that's what you're gonna kind of more pursue in a way. So even throughout your whole life, family, business, government, it's gonna come out whatever you believe.
Okay, yeah. I guess part of why I was asking was because democracy was kind of, to my knowledge, originally an Athenian ideal, and that originated in a country that was obviously not Christian, although it did have a religious disposition. So, if you could say the progression of society kind of leads us to a culmination in a Christian democracy such as America, is the Christianity of democracy inherent to it, or would the presence of polytheism corrupt America, or is any form of religion sufficient to hold democracy?
I don't think any religion is adequate to sustain democracy. I think you can have democracy, but it's not gonna like last long, or even be really good for the people, because Christianity does bring a strict morality to it that the other religions don't. So,
We couldn't even decide what morality was when we were doing the debate the other day.
oh boy. Man, another one? Alex.
Okay, so I've got a couple questions you sent in the paper, by the way. So in your paper, you talk a lot about government and how Christians should interact with government, and you later use Romans 13 to show that Christians should obey government and that is God mandated, that they should respect that authority. You later say that this biblical passage clearly is referring to good governments and ministers of God doing His will. So my question is, what exactly is a good government according to your paper, and how do you know that it is specifically these good governments that are the ones referred to in Romans 13?
What I kind of was trying to get at was that the only good governments are the only ones that people should follow are good governments. And if they aren't good, like they're evil, they're not doing God's will, then they recognize that they can rise up and overthrow that government, because technically they aren't doing God's will and aren't the government. What was your question again?
Well, that answered most of it. Applying that to a more specific example, I guess, to kind of narrow the question, would you then say that even our American government today would fit under that mandate of a good government that we should obey because of Romans 13, even though our government at current allows such things as abortion and gay marriage?
I would say it's the type of government that allows for the people to follow him in whatever way they choose to, because people have differing beliefs, different ways to follow God, because we're all different. Some like to go to God through more reason aspects, some like to go through the heart. So a government that allows people to choose how they want to follow God and worship Him is the type of government that I would say is a good government. So that being said, ours allowing abortion and gay marriage is stepping away from being a good government in a way. They're kind of leading away from a good government because they're restricting life and not promoting God's will.
Okay, and then my second topic question is just a quick one. You also talk about the Declaration and their God-given rights and whatnot. So then, within the bounds of your paper, what exactly are these God-given rights, and how do you know that men inherently have them, and that those should be protected by government?
It's kind of similar to what your paper was off of. So, so how do you know that we have God-given rights? Is that basically as simple as your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can see it in the Bible itself when God gave man life on earth. Even after man fell and sinned against God, he still allowed them to live on earth, which means he wasn't going to judge them yet. So he has a specific role to play on this earth, and so he has right to life and liberty, to do as he chose, because man did choose to do wrong, and he get punished for it right away. So he does have a liberty and a life on earth, and so with that also proceeds. So that's how you could tell is from the very beginning of the creation of man, when he was made, that he has that God-given rights.
Okay, thank you.
Last question.
Oh boy, you're making it difficult. There's 4 people. Give you to Joseph.
Okay. Oh wait, I only have one question left. All right, I'll make it quick. You say here in your paper, good paper by the way. I really enjoyed it. You say man's inherent freedom is shown through this grace. Grace is the allowance of free will, the ability to pursue happiness, rightly or wrongly, for an allotted amount of time before the payment becomes due. Does that mean that grace extends to all men, and that all men now have the jurisdiction to do whatever they want, and that grace will still cover them? Is that what you mean?
I'm saying that grace is the time that God has allowed man to make his peace with God, in a sense. So it is extended to all men, that they are given us time before they are judged to make their peace with God.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm...
Yeah, I think
Thank you very much, Ms. Bradley.